Throughout this tutorial series, you might have noticed that every time I click on a single node or a set of nodes, the this little window down here actually updates, and sometimes even the 3D view updates. Let's say if I were to bring in this black or bring it up to in white. And basically, I want to talk a little bit about these two windows. This is the 2D view and the 3D view. The 2D view is a little bit more simpler view of the 3D view. It's kind of more like if you're looking at the image as a flat texture, whereas the 3D view is an actual 3D model with the texture applied to it. So for example, if we were to kind of bring in a grunge, let's see, connect it into here. So you'll notice that we can see the grunge map as a 2D flat image, but also we can rotate around this cube, and you'll notice that this grunge is there as well. A lot of the things that you could do in the 2D view are actually down here docked on this kind of smaller bar. This bar you can actually freely move, like we discussed in the first video about docking different things, so we can move it to the top or bottom if we'd like. But each one of these buttons kind of corresponds to something that you can do inside of the 2D view, whether that be changing the channels, being able to see the RGB, or it might give you some sort of information. So I kind of want to go over what each of these little buttons does up here. If you're always kind of wondering what each one does, you can kind of just hover your mouse over it and you'll get a little description of what the button does. But to get started, we'll go over this RGBA kind of isolation view. So if we want, we can actually isolate the different channels. So if we do, we can look at the green channel, we can look at the blue, and so on. But because this grunge mask is actually in grayscale, it's not going to give us a good representation of how to utilize this button. So I'll do a quick little demo here. So if we bring in an RGBA merge node, what an RGBA merge node does is you can actually plug in different kind of masks or shapes into the different channels, and it'll give you a single pack map. So let's just bring in a basic shape. Let's duplicate with Control D. Control D duplicates nodes, so let's do that a couple times. We're just going to change the shape of this. We'll do a bell as well. So if I plug in this to the R, G, and B, you'll notice this is kind of the mask we get. Now, say we wanted to see in this preview what just the red channel was, we can actually uncheck the blue and the green channel, and you'll see that this is actually the shape we have originally here. And same thing corresponds with if we switched it to the green channel, we'll have this kind of circle shape that you can see here, and same goes with the blue. And if you wanted to just see the alpha channel, you can actually click a little to the left on here and you'll see this kind of icon change into the checkerboard, and that means it's looking for something that's in the alpha channel. Right now we don't have something plugged in, but if we were to duplicate this again, let's change this to a pyramid, for example. If we plug that into here, and you'll notice now that you can actually see the alpha channel now that we just recently plugged in. So the button directly to the right of the RGB button is the enable alpha button. And by default, every time you open Substance, this button is actually enabled by default. You'll notice that because it has this kind of gray box around it, and you'll notice that the icon is this gray checkerboard. Now that's why we're getting this kind of almost ghost effect. If we were to turn this on, you'll be able to, or sorry, turn it off, you'll be actually able to see the whole texture as a whole. That's why, say for example, if we didn't have an alpha channel connected, right, and we had just this back to being enabled, we wouldn't see anything until we disabled this kind of alpha channel. This essentially, it kind of forces the 2D view to actually view your alpha channel. So there have been problems when I work that this being on kind of messes up my workflow. For example, one of those times is when I'm using a flood fill node. I'll just show you guys a quick example of how this is shown. So let's do an edge detect. Let's do a cells. Let's bring down the cells here. Plug this into an edge detect, and then plug this into a fill. So every time I use a flood fill, I end up getting this kind of view, and it's not really helpful to see what's going on. And to get kind of a better picture of what is going on, I actually do turn off this enable alpha and I get a better representation. A lot of the times when you're actually working in Substance, this doesn't tend to be a problem because in the beginning you're using a lot of the grayscale nodes. So it actually doesn't matter if you have it turned on and off. But this is just something to be wary about in case you do start getting this weird transparent effect. You can just easily turn it on and off. Next up is the display luminance button. This one, again, it's not really helpful when you're working in grayscale values. So if you turn this on and on, it's just a on and off switch. It doesn't really change anything. But if you were working, let's say in actual RGB values, so let's say like a green, if you turn this on and off, it'll actually show you the grayscale values, the luminance values. So actually, again, with this flood fill, if we take this alpha off and we have all these different kind of RGB values, we can actually see the grayscale values if we were to turn this on and off. Now, the button to the right of that is actually a button I use fairly often when I'm currently working, and that is the display tiling on and off button. And as you can see, you can actually display the tiling of your texture in a repeatable pattern. So if we turn this on, you'll notice that it's actually showing you the pattern repeating 100 times. I'm zooming in and out by just using my scroll wheel, as we sometimes do in the graph view. And then when you hover over your mouse, you'll faintly see a red line, and that is the actual texture that you're currently working in. That's kind of the part that is right on the edges of where it's repeating. So another hotkey that we can do is actually just press the space bar, and that does the exact same thing if we were to turn this button on and off. I know we talked about a little bit in the last video about the tiling modes, and this is actually a great way to see the tiling mode of something as well. So if we do kind of that same example we had, if we bring in a shape, let's scale it down a little bit. Let's do a transform and move it off to the side. You can actually see it tiling, but if we really want to see what was going on, we can actually press this, and now you can actually see the tiling of it. And this is where you find the edges of that shape. Next up is the image information button. And what this does is almost like an eyedropper in Photoshop. If you were to kind of move your cursor around anywhere in the 2D view, it'll give you a little bit information of the different values and the kind of hue saturation values as well. Next, we have the histogram kind of information dialog box. So this, again, it kind of just shows the different histogram ranges for your different channels if you'd like to see that as well. From here, we have the sRGB toggle button. So if you want to see your image in sRGB. And finally, this is the button to pre-multiply your alpha if you'd like to do that. From here on the right side, we have a few interesting buttons in here. We can actually fit the 2D view into actual view. So if we just hit this, it'll kind of snap it so you could see your entire texture. Say if we zoomed out too much and you can't really see it, you can actually just hit this and it'll zoom it back in. Same thing for kind of the button next to it. It'll give you a 1-to-1 of your texture. So kind of zoom into really close up so you can kind of see it up close in details, and we can actually just hit that again so we could kind of go back into our full mode. These buttons, the plus and the minus, can actually zoom in if you don't want to use the scroll wheel like we do here. Another way that we can actually zoom into this is if we're kind of all the way zoomed out here, you can press the Z key and that'll kind of snap it right close into kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. Same thing, if we hit the F key, it actually frames the entire texture. And this final button off to the very right, the lock icon, is actually super helpful when working in different resolutions with nodes, kind of how we talked about in the previous video about changing your node sizes. So for example, if we took this exact same uniform scale and change the resolution of it, so if we go into the output size, do absolute, so we change it to, I don't know, let's do it 256 by 256. You'll notice that every time we click a different resolution, it actually tries to give you the actual resolution inside of the 2D view. Now, this can get super annoying and tedious if you're constantly moving between two different nodes of different resolutions and you're having to constantly zoom into the 256. If you just wanted to keep it in the same kind of zoom scale that you have in your 2D view, you can actually unlock this and you can actually keep it consistent throughout when you're changing, like switching between different nodes. So let's just move this toolbar and dock it down here because this is where it is when you first open Designer. And we'll talk about these final buttons up here. The first one is really cool if you'd like to use a reference image inside of your 2D view. You can actually kind of pick whatever image you want and you could kind of move and change the transparency of it. So it's a nice way of, like, if you wanted to know the size of something that to put on your texture, this is a great way to do that. You can get rid of it by just pressing the X. The next one, fairly simple. It saves out an image of the 2D view. So if you wanted to do that, you could change kind of what kind of file format you want. So we could just name it green image and save it to the desktop. Same thing goes with the copy to the clipboard. This is a great way if you just want to copy this 2D view and just paste it into something like Photoshop. This next one is grayed out by default, but if you wanted to kind of make it available, you can actually click on any single one output that you have inside of your graph view. So if we click on this, you'll see that it instantly gets turned on, and we can actually cycle through the different outputs that you have. So this is pretty much the same if you were to click on these different outputs, but instead it's all right here. This next one is UV, and again, it's grayed out by default. But if we went into this 3D view and under scene, go to display UVs in 2D, this actually shows the UVs for this cube that we have in our 3D view. So again, if this actual cube had more than one UV set, we can actually choose which UV set to display. Same thing goes if we change the model, we could change it to like this kind of material ball, and you'll notice that we have the UVs for this model. And that pretty much covers everything in the 2D view. Since we're on the topic of 3D models, let's go ahead and cover the 3D view a little bit. So the 3D view and the graph view share kind of the same hotkeys and mouse controls to get around. If you hold the left mouse, you can actually rotate your 3D model. With the mouse wheel, you could zoom in and out. And with the right mouse, you can actually zoom in and out as well. Another thing you could do is you could hold the middle mouse and you could pan around. Now, say we accidentally moved or panned the object a little too far off the screen and we're getting some weird rotation. We can actually hit the F key to place it back in the middle, and now the camera is rotating around the actual object itself. While we're on the topic of camera controls, we also have the same ability to kind of come up here into the drop down for the camera. And you can also change the camera position through this kind of drop down that you have. So you could choose a front facing camera, you can do a left, perspective, and so on down the list. Another cool thing inside the camera, you have a bunch of different properties. As soon as you choose edit selected, the properties for said camera that you have chosen gives you a bunch of different parameters and settings that you can change, as we kind of described a little bit in the last video with the properties. We can change the focal length of the camera, we can change the color of the background, we could change the clip planes, and it's just a bunch of different settings that you'd find in most kind of 3D programs as far as camera settings. Now, just like the 2D view, in the 3D view, we also have a top toolbar with a bunch of different drop downs that we can use to manipulate this kind of 3D view. So we'll start off by talking with the scene drop down. The scene drop down gives you a list of different meshes that you could change in your 3D view and kind of preview your materials in different scenarios. So if we want to see like your texture on a plane or a sphere, you're free to do that inside the scene dropdown. Me personally, I always like to keep it on cube, or I also like to use rounded cube. Sometimes I even go and do, I believe, rounded cylinder. It just gives you a nice way to kind of see your material on different surfaces to kind of get a sense of what your material is doing. Next up is the materials dropdown, and from here, this is where you actually are able to choose the kind of shader that you'd like to use inside a 3D view. So me personally, I use the metallic and roughness workflow, so I always have it selected on physically metallic and roughness. If you'd like, you could switch it to specular glossiness. You could just do a regular blend and a Lambert. Another really cool feature that I love using with the metallic roughness or specular glossiness is the tessellation setting. So once you select tessellation, we'll actually get a few different settings to manipulate inside of your properties. For example, if you have a height map plugged in, we can actually change the tessellation factor and the scale of it. Right now, we don't have much height information going on, but let's do a quick example and plug something in. So if we went and did, let's do a shape, and let's do a square and just bring it down a little bit. I'm going to turn off UV inside of the 2D view so we can just see what's going on. Let's bring in a blur. Just blur it a tiny bit. Let's just keep it right there. Now let's plug in all of these kind of connectors. One thing about the connectors, if you have something connected through multiple inputs, you can actually hold the main connection point, hold shift and then left click, and then you'll actually be able to move all the connectors at one point. So again, just kind of click back on where you want to connect, and there you go. Now, I kind of want to go over why every time we connect something, it live updates the 3D view. And that kind of goes back into the templates that we first chose when we're creating our project. If we go back into File, New Substance, and under the templates, we'll have the different outputs that it creates. So we have base color, normal, roughness, metallic, ambient, and height. So all of these outputs are actually connected to the 3D view. The 3D view is looking for nodes that are considered output nodes. So right now, because all of these outputs are base color, normal, roughness, metallic, ambient, and height, they're all interconnected with this 3D view. That's why every time we update, for example, the uniform color to a different color, it auto updates the 3D view. Same thing if we were to say plug in a shape in here. Let's do a disk. Let's scale it down, and let's kind of take all these connections and plug them in here. You'll notice it updated all the different outputs and it showed all that changes inside the 3D view. Let's say we only had a uniform color output, or let's say we actually just had a base color output and we just deleted all these. You'll notice that nothing changed in the 3D view. That's because it's still kind of reading what we had there before. If we wanted to see the live preview of actually what's going on in the 3D graph, we can right click anywhere inside the graph and do view outputs in 3D. So right now, because all we have is a base color output, that's all we're going to see. Now, say we want to see the shape as a normal. So if we took a normal map output, node, and plugged in this shape, and then let's do OpenGL. Let's kind of blur it so we get some nice beveled edges. Bring down the quality, up the intensity. We'll have this kind of nice little normal that we have. Now we have this normal node, but there is actually no normal output. Now, what if we wanted to see this? So all we would have to do is right click on the node and view in 3D. From here, a dialog box opens up with all these different connections that we could plug in corresponding to 3D view. Now, because this is a normal map, we can easily just plug it into the normal map. Now, this is kind of almost like a hack in a sense, because we're not actually connecting anything to an output node. It's kind of just doing a one-time preview of this. Say we did the exact same thing when we right-click view outputs in 3D, it completely disappears. To actually create an output node, all we have to do is do spacebar or however method you'd like to use to bring in a node, and we do an output node. From here, this actually creates an output node, but this node specifically doesn't have kind of the properties of what kind of output node it is. So if we go down here to the right under properties, we'll be able to add an item. And from here, we have a list of all the different kind of outputs that Substance can read. So if we wanted to bring in a normal, we can just start typing it in and it autofills. So now we have this as a normal node. So if we can plug this back in and then view outputs in 3D, we'll get the exact same results that we just had. So if we go back to our previous example where we had just finished plugging in a shape into all the outputs, you'll notice that we are getting the preview of all this shape inside of the 3D view because it is connecting to the normal roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and height. You'll notice that height isn't really doing much, and that's because we don't have a scale factor inside the tessellation. So if we go back into materials and choose our shader by going into default definitions and choosing the metallic roughness and going into tessellation, the properties window will show the scale factor of our height map. So if we just push that a little bit, you'll actually see the map is finally doing what we wanted and what was intended. The geometry is actually changing silhouette, and we're able to see the shape of the square changing the geometry a little bit. Next up, we'll talk about the lights drop down. And from here, we can actually change the ambient color. We can turn on some point lights. So if we turn these on, you won't see them too much right off the bat. So if we actually just bump it up to like 60 or something, we can actually see it as we rotate the mesh around. But if you want to actually rotate the light itself, you can hold the L and left mouse, and you can kind of place and position the light where you'd like it to. Speaking about lights, the next kind of tab that we can talk about a little bit is the environment tab, and this affects the lighting of your model quite significantly. So if we actually do environment edit and then actually turn on the environment, we can actually see the background and kind of the ambient light that it's kind of reflecting. If we actually go back into the lights, turn off this ambient light, and we can actually see the way the the environment lighting is affecting this kind of mesh. One way to rotate the lighting is Control and Shift and right click, and we actually rotate the environment. We have a few other settings under the environment tab. So if you want to change the exposure of the environment, if you rather not use the hotkey of Control Shift and the right mouse button, we can actually just rotate the angle of the environment in here as well. Now, we actually do have a bunch of different environments to choose from, and that can be located here in the library tab. So if we go down to, there should be one that is environments. Here we go, environments under the 3D view. We can actually just take any one of these different environments and just left click, drag, and drop into the 3D view, and instantly you'll see kind of the way the environment and lighting changes. This one has kind of a more greener tone, so we're getting those kind of greener highlights and greener shadows. Same thing with different kind of environments that you bring in. Later on inside in the next video, I'll kind of go over more about the library. Now, the final two tabs are display and renderer. The display tab is a bunch of different toggles that you can turn on and off inside of the 3D viewport. To give you guys a better representation of this, we'll just turn off the environment by going back to the environment, edit, turn off visible. And then we can actually turn on the bounding box if we'd like around the mesh. We can show the grid if we'd like. We can show the light position. So a better way to see this actual light position into effect is if we go back into the lights, we turn on a point light, and now you can clearly see where the light is pointing. So let's just bump this up, put like a crazy color on here. Let's do like a 60. And again, we can hold L and then move with the left mouse click, and you'll see that this light kind of arrow is moving while you're rotating the camera around. This is just a nice way to see exactly where the light is hitting. And again, we can turn all of these different toggles off, and it'll give you different settings to play with here. Finally, the renderer is Substance Designer's rendering that it uses inside of the 3D viewport. You can either choose OpenGL or iRay. iRay is kind of their more photorealistic renderer, so it uses a bunch of your your GPU power. So inside of here, you can change the minimum samples, the max samples, the time in seconds. So it's kind of a little bit heavy if you don't have a nice enough graphics card, but it can make your renders look really photoreal. And that's pretty much it. That's all that covers the 3D view. Next up, we're going to go over our last and final panel, and that's the library.